Françoise, special thanks to you and greetings from Bloomington, a town you've been to before, and I've had the pleasure of spending time with you and your family in Jerusalem. For those of you who are tuning in, you're in for really a very, very interesting talk by our speaker. Françoise and her family have lived in Israel for the last 18 years. Her family's origins are in North Africa, specifically the city of Oran in Algeria, which some of you may know through its association with the famous writer Albert Camus. She's a native French speaker and a fluent Hebrew and English speaker as well. As Günther mentioned, she's at Tel Aviv University, where she's very active as a researcher. And I'm proud to say that this book, which Günther mentioned, Françoise's latest book, True to My God and Country, is now the second book she's published with us. Prior to this book, she published a book on young Holocaust survivors and how they rebuilt their lives in the aftermath of the war. I've learned lots from reading True to My God and Country. Among other things, of the 16 million Americans who were enlisted in the US Armed Forces during World War II, fully 500,000 of them were American Jews. And among that group, there were some 10,000 or more American Jewish women who were actively involved, in fact, in the military, including the Air Force during World War II. That's a special feature of Françoise's latest book, which readers will certainly benefit from reading and learning from. I did for sure. I also learned lots from what she had to say about American GIs in the North African theater. Most of what we know deals with American soldiers in Europe for obvious reasons, but numbers of them were in North Africa, where for the first time, many American Jewish fighters came into contact with Mizrahi Jews. And it meant a great deal to them and to their hosts in the North African countries as well. She also discusses American prisoners of war in the Pacific theater, something likewise that opened my eyes to a phenomenon I was unaware of. But enough from me. For now, it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Françoise. We look forward to hearing you and learning from you.
Well, thank you, Professor Rosenfeld, for your kind introduction and for inviting me to participate in this inspiring series of webinars. I'm honored to share some of the issues highlighted in my book entitled True to My God and Country. You said it. In most of the 100 memoirs, interviews, and other first-person accounts I examined, I found that Jewish service members often conveyed the additional mental pressure felt as Jews, or a feeling that Jews must remain on the alert. American soldiers obviously reflected prejudice omnipresent in the American society at large in the 1940s. In the context of today's rising anti-Semitism in the United States and elsewhere, this presentation will hopefully provide further insights into the intersection of history with current anti-Jewish attitudes. Over 500,000 Jewish men and women, you mentioned it, served. Now, do I have to share again my, yes?
Yes, please.
I have to share my, okay, my screen. I was just mentioning the numbers. Over 500,000 Jewish men and women served in the armed forces during World War II, spread throughout every branch of the armed forces during World War II. And over all fighting fronts. My research highlights their encounters with Jews and Jewish communities in Europe, French North Africa, you mentioned it, and the Pacific. This perspective shows how these interactions encourage Jewish GIs to fight anti-Semitism, both among fellow members of the armed forces and in the war against Germany and its allies. This lecture challenges the perception of a singular form of Jewish identification and suggests that rather than suppressing identification as Jews, anti-Jewish hostility may have led to a reawakening, a strengthening, or an appearance of so-called religious feeling. I therefore would like to examine how Jewish men and women responded to anti-Jewish attitudes. Finally, I would like to question the common perception that Jewishness remained a burden for GIs in the American military. By anti-Jewish attitudes, I mean hostility to Jews based on an irrational suspicion or resentment of Jews or contempt. So, what were the most frequent manifestations of anti-Jewish hostility encountered then in the military? Did they affect in the same ways Jews whose Jewish identification was strong and indifferent Jews alienated from Judaism? Now, two main categories of Jewish service members may be delineated: the indifferent Jew and the proud Jew. That is to say, the Jew for whom Jewishness is a heritage or is meaningful. The boundaries of these categories may overlap or be porous. These distinctions emerge especially from some 50 memoirs of American service members written in 1946, when their war experiences were still fresh in their minds. Indifferent Jews, on the one hand, felt that their Jewishness was a psychic burden in the military, of course, and especially if they perceived their Jewishness as an accident of birth and not a meaningful heritage. Most of the veterans who submitted their wartime memoirs to the YIVO institution belonged to the category of the indifferent Jew. On the other hand, proud Jews who relate their encounters with Jews and Jewish communities abroad during their furloughs felt their Jewishness was meaningful. Participation in religious services abroad led them to build friendships with local Jews. This occurred after the Anglo-American landing on the shores of French North Africa during Operation Torch on November the 8th, 1942. Moses Klicksberg rightly noticed in an article about the veterans' memoirs that the greater the estrangement from Judaism, the more intense was the manner in which they described the potency of anti-Jewish incidents. On the other hand, Jews who considered Jewishness as a heritage were ready to pay a price for their being Jewish. They tended to describe anti-Semitic incidents with calm and sometimes humor. In his biography, entitled Leaving Home, former Marine Art Buchwald wrote, "I can tell you how exhausting it is to continually defend all the chosen people. The anti-Semitism I experienced was mild, if you don't include the time Fedlock broke my thumb because he said I had killed Christ." On this slide, you have another quote from him, which is also interesting. So the veteran mentioned various manifestations of anti-Jewish prejudice in the armed forces, including being a coward, not being good at anything, or not being military material. But humor and derision apparently helped the former Marine overcome anti-Jewish hostility. He noted that when soldiers saw that fighting anti-Semitism led nowhere, they gave up on constantly defending their self-respect. When such confrontations consume too much energy, they remain silent, and their attitude could have been wrongly interpreted as passivity. Many memoirs written in 1946 account for the respect acquired through a fist fight that equated masculinity with fighting. You see in that slide an immigrant who escaped Nazi Germany with his mother, infantryman Ernest Stock, had to engage in a fist fight to gain the respect of his fellow soldiers. This is how he described what followed the fight. They came to pat me on the shoulder and shake hands with me, not only my friends, but those whom I had thought my enemies. The infantryman provides a good example of the dynamics of identity that occurred in a military base in Georgia. Before entering the army, most of his social contacts were Jewish. And that was actually the case for the majority of Jewish soldiers. He wrote that his stay at the basic training camp had taught him that, I quote, to hide one's being in a Gentile world was the wrong course. I had learned to speak up as a Jew and to be proud of it. Toward the end of his basic training, the infantryman analyzed how camaraderie was born 4 months later. The friction, I quote, prejudice and hard feelings have all but disappeared. And deep in my heart, I feel a genuine affection for the bunch. They're all good boys at heart, though sometimes ignorant and unpolished. His fellow soldiers must have been exposed to caricatures that were current at that time, where Jews could be seen with horns on their heads, like the devil, but time spent together in basic training, in battle, or in prisoner of war camps led to a realization that Jews were first and foremost Americans ready to sacrifice their lives. So, wartime contacts between Jews and Gentiles began to break through the barriers of prejudice. Now, reflecting on his own transformation, the infantryman analyzed his evolution from his initial indifference towards spiritual things to his new attraction to religious services. The atmosphere which reigned in religious services reminded him of the candles his mother would light on Friday nights. His memoir conveys a feeling of belonging both to the subgroup of Jews in the American military and to the Jewish people at large. Now, among Jewish GIs, a feeling of collective responsibility emerged during the war. And the greater the estrangement, the more anxiety was expressed when describing the improper behavior of another Jewish serviceman. Some veterans wrote that they had to behave as best as they could because they didn't want the American military to think that Jews were not good people. Many servicemen noticed that when a Jew does something wrong, he is usually called a dirty Jew. But when a Christian does something wrong, it usually gets unnoticed. Indifferent Jews feel this double standard as a burden and wish that Jews would not get into trouble, of course. Now, some Christian chaplains were more sympathetic to the needs of Jewish GIs than others. Those who conducted Jewish services with respect empowered Jewish service members. The same nuances could be applied to non-Jewish officers who facilitated religious observance, even in hostile territories in the Pacific in 1943, like on this slide. Now, in North Africa, here you have the main street in Oran. Being the adopted GI, perceived, of course, as a liberator, being the adopted GI of a North African Jewish family brought feelings of home. As a soldier wrote wittingly about those families, their hearts were bigger than their cupboards. A transformation took place among indifferent Jews in their attitudes towards Judaism through their interactions with Jewish families in French North Africa. These Jews who had lost their rights to French citizenship in North Africa communicated somehow to Jewish GIs, and they told them how they suffered from the anti-Jewish Vichy laws implemented in the French colony. Many GIs actually admire their resilience and dignity. These encounters with local Jews instilled in them a sense of Jewish peoplehood and boosted their morale to continue the war and fight anti-Semitism on both fronts. Here you have the synagogue of Oran. So in other instances, indifferent Jews and proud Jews alike were impressed by the turnout for the celebration of the high holidays by Jewish GIs at the Great Synagogue of Oran. With their steel helmets on and their weapons on their shoulders, they were offered a symbol of might. That synagogue could actually accommodate 1,000 worshippers. Previously perceived as a crutch, I may say that the Jewish religion was now perceived as might. So these interactions also reinforced and bolstered connections to their American Jewish identities. Now, how did Jews who felt their Jewishness was meaningful cope with anti-Semitism? When in France, young Private Harold Baumgarten behaved differently than Jewish GIs who obeyed the orders of their commanders and threw away their dog tags to avoid the possibility of being sent to slave labor camps or shot by the Nazis. The dog tags issued to Jewish service members were stamped with an H for Hebrew and contained useful personal information such as name, serial number, date of most recent tetanus shot, and blood type. Many officers, like the famous General Maurice Rose, who had fought during World War I and also continued in World War II, did not fight with an H on their dog tags because of prejudiced promotion practices. Baumgarten's attitude towards the German was one of defiance as soon as he landed on Omaha Beach in French Normandy. in the first wave landing of the 116th Infantry Division on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, he wore his field jacket, on the back of which he drew a big Star of David. Underneath the Jewish star, he wrote, "The Bronx, New York." The 19-year-old became a proud Jewish American GI, fighting Amalek, a figure who embodies evil in the Torah. He was seriously wounded 5 times, but survived and became a doctor. And he was an Orthodox Jew. Now, another case, a tail gunner on a bomber B-24, Bernard Branson, formerly Abramson of the US Army Corps, provides another inspiring example of a GI whose Jewishness was an asset. Working as a team was required by the Air Force, so he gradually got along. And here on this slide, you have an example of typical colloquial dialogue. His crew, like most crews, was in fact cemented by determination to fight and fear. The tail gunner claimed that he wanted the Nazis to realize that it was a Jew who was dropping the bombs. And yet, within the Air Corps, there was an awareness that the fate of American Jews captured by the Nazis could be distinct from the lot of others. And for many, as I mentioned, discarding dog tags remained a dilemma. But for Abramson, the possibility of not dying as a Jew must have loomed in his mind as a betrayal of his parents. Now, in his work on anti-Semitism in America, historian Leonard Dinerstein highlighted the fact that for the first time in American history in the 1930s, American Jews thought that Jew haters in the United States might acquire a kind of political influence similar to those in Europe. He mentioned that some Christian soldiers would later on during the war shout, "We're out to kill Jews tonight." A GI expressed his frustration in this way. Many of the boys think of the Jews as aliens, that the war is being fought to save Jewish kikes. Now, I would like to read how chilling the 1930s were for American Jews. So these hostile manifestations threaten the social acceptance of American Jews and made them vulnerable. Jews might be accused both of being invisible, making them an object of suspicion, and of being too visible, of standing out instead of blending in. Faced with these contradictory accusations, Jewish servicemen and servicewomen behaved as American patriots, exemplifying zeal, boldness, and heroism. At the same time, they strove to debunk negative anti-Jewish stereotypes and gain social acceptance in the military. At a time when racism was a strong current in American society, the Marines and Army Air Corps refused to accept African American soldiers in their ranks at the beginning of the war. These soldiers were relegated to non-combat and menial tasks, serving in segregated units, as you may know. As the war went on, they were allowed to become officers and engage in combat. In January 1941, the War Department formed an all-Black pursuit squadron of the US Army Corps, the Tuskegee, and in fact, the Tuskegee Airmen were very often highly appreciated by Jewish pilots. Not only because they did a good job, but also because Jews could identify with the rejection experienced by African Americans in society at large. But as you know, no special unit was established for Jewish GIs who were considered a religious minority, not a racial one. However, they could suddenly be ignored or rejected by others when their Jewish identity was revealed or discovered. Now, legendary movie actor Kirk Douglas provides an example. Before he became a GI, his name was Isur Danielovich, later changed to Izzy Dembski. He recalled his sadness when, on campus, he was abruptly rejected by a group of students with whom he was meant to have dinner and who did not even see the need to find an excuse. He actually said in his memoir that he thought that universities were above anti-Semitism. Disillusioned, instead of facing social exclusion, the youth decided to pass as a Gentile to gain the social acceptance he wanted. He changed his name to Kirk Douglas, and that move made it easier for him to join the Navy and then train as a communications officer in anti-submarine warfare. Douglas explained that now he was invisible as a Jew. Interestingly enough, he was introduced to another level of anti-Semitism. That's his quote. He admitted that at the time, his response to anti-Jewish hostility corresponded to a strategy of assimilation. In some instances, he would say he was half Jewish, I quote, to minimize the stigma of being a Jew. So changing one's name was a way to cope with anti-Jewish attitudes, but some nuances must be spelled out. An aviator, Surgeon Milton Fields, born Finkelstein, took this step in 1942 to avoid anti-Jewish prejudice during training in the Air Corps. Yet he volunteered as a lay leader to conduct Jewish services in Iran and Iraq. So his example underlines that changing one's name to avoid rejection does not equate to abandoning Judaism. And that's an important nuance. Joining the armed forces provided service members with various perspectives on anti-Semitism. Now, Selma Kenter Cronin, a certified civilian pilot before the war, was invited by Jacqueline Cochran in 1943 to join the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP. Selma Kenter wanted to fight Hitler and accepted to be part of the program in the hope of being sent overseas. But the WASP were disbanded without military status on December the 20th, 1944. But anyway, they remained in the home front. Yet they had done military drills and tested military planes after being damaged in crash landings and repaired. So doubly victim of prejudice, Selma confessed that during her service, she never hid her Jewish identity, but felt ambivalent after experiencing rejection by her counterparts on the military base. She wondered whether, actually, afterwards, in her interview in 2000, she wondered if she shouldn't have been more discreet about her origin. And she admitted that she understood only later why she was excluded from some activities on the base. In fact, her sudden appearance as a Jew behind the mask of a woman pilot caused alarm because of prejudice misconceptions. Selma felt that her Jewish identity came as an insult to some people when it did come out. As in the case of Douglas, rejection was not voiced by anyone, but a feeling of belonging to a group vanished. It was as if their previous invisibility as a Jew became a threat to non-Jews. The frustration the woman pilot expressed years later stemmed from her awareness of a gap between her being part of a Jewish sub-community and belonging to the larger American community. Now, unlike Douglas, the baseball star Hank Greenberg, born Hyman Greenberg, identified strongly as a Jew. His choice not to play on Yom Kippur in September 1934 was welcomed by Jewish Americans. He was one of the most visible Americans of Jewish origin, and as the phrase goes, a beacon of hope and social integration. Greenberg willingly interrupted his career to serve in the armed forces because his country came first. Although he was honorably discharged 2 days before the attack against Pearl Harbor, he re-enlisted as a sergeant and volunteered for the Army Air Corps. Serving in the China-Burma-India theater for over 6 months, his assignment was to locate sites for B-29 bombers. But no other major league player served his country out of patriotism for such a long period, that is 47 months. A secular Jew excelling in a sport that was a badge of both American identity and masculinity helped his integration as a Jewish GI. Reflecting on the effect of anti-Semitic slurs on his life, Greenberg admitted that humiliating provocations had an impact on him. I quote, "It would always hit me like a cold shower." But to him, these anti-Jewish slurs were not the burden. They were meant for Jews in the eyes of Gentiles. On the contrary, he observed, "I found it to be of a great help. Humiliation, I contend, can be a launching pad for those who have the resilience to rebound." Now, rejection based on prejudice linked to the image of Jews applied both to men and women who wanted to fly. Young women who took part in the WWII program encountered those challenges. A woman pilot recorded the following remark: "I can remember one instructor saying, 'Those Jewish girls can't fly,' and he was washing them out right and left." On these slides, Bernice for Haydu. Now, she did not encounter discrimination on the base, although she received many letters from her mother asking about this, but she tried to reassure her, and she wrote in a letter, "I want them to know," referring to her Jewish identity. She later added that in her bay of 6 women pilots, they practiced 6 different religions and yet got along well. Now, famous Polish-American artist Arthur Cheek suggested that a transformation of American Jewish self-representation took place during World War II. Jewish GIs, in his eyes, had gained new self-confidence. In 1943, several of his illustrations of Jewish heroes were exhibited in the United Service Organizations, or USO, venues for recreational activities put on for the men and women in the American military. Now, with this lithograph, the artist captured the wartime transformation that gradually changed servicemen's ideas of themselves as Jews. Captain Colin Kelly, whom you see on the right, the bomber's pilot, and Sergeant Mayor Levin, his Jewish bombardier, which you also see on the left in a picture, were part of the aircraft crew that bombed a Japanese vessel 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So these were really heroes. The airman's story remained emblematic of the selflessness and spirit of camaraderie that empowered American Jewish service members. And we may say that the American military had become a sort of laboratory of religious and social experiments at that time. Now, 4 main strategies for confronting anti-Jewish prejudice emerged. Being, I quote, 3 times as good just to be even, as a fighter pilot explained. Setting an example of extreme bravery, inspiring esteem through physical force, and fostering respect for Jewishness, as chaplains did when conducting Jewish religious services. As a reaction to social exclusion, some Jewish GIs sought the company of co-religionists, which was likely to awaken or reinforce their Jewish identification. And this may be called small group solidarity. Now, while I won't develop the issue of gender discrimination, I will simply recall the fact that some service women had to confront anti-Jewish hostility as well as sexist attitudes. Some service women encroached on male territory, even though they were meant to free up, that's the expression, the phrase, male soldiers for the front lines. Pilot Selma Kenter highlighted that she may have been excluded from some things. We saw that at the base because she was unidentifiable as Jewish. This attitude may have stemmed from representations of Jews as conspirators, traitors, and infiltrators. Such accusations had been made relentlessly throughout the 40s. In a previous webinar, Alvin Rosenfeld demonstrated that the phrase, "the Jews are guilty," is an expression of contempt originating centuries ago in church teachings demonizing Jews. In this regard, the efforts of the National Jewish Welfare Board in printing and distributing 1 million religious books during World War II must be spelled out. A line in the pocket-sized prayer book reads, you have the line, and this remark expresses a symbiosis between American and Jewish values. Now, how to account for the bitter disappointment of some GIs still feeling discriminated against at the end of the war? Jewish Americans sacrificed their lives in the hope that Jew hatred and discrimination would vanish at home and abroad. But anti-Semitic folk humor was conveyed in mock versions of the Roll of Honor. GIs mentioned the distribution of anti-Semitic flyers on the pier. One of them included lines which singled out GIs with Jewish names, who were supposed to have benefited from the war It read, first American to sink a Jap ship, Colin Kelly. We saw that. Etc. First person to do that with an American name. But it went on. First American to get 4 new ties, Abram Lipschitz. On that flyer, of course, no mention was made of Captain Colin Kelly's partner, Sergeant Mayer Levin. Significantly, the 1945 film, The House I Live In, made use of the partnership between the Presbyterian pilot and his Jewish bombardier, who was the first American to bomb a Japanese ship. By telling a wartime story to a group of boys who bullied a schoolmate on account of his Jewish origin, actor Frank Sinatra conveyed the message that religion makes no difference. Facts about the important participation of American Jews became known, and that's important to know, towards the end of the war, thanks to publications like Jews Fight Too. To conclude, these various narratives attest to the dedication of Jewish GIs to their country and show that camaraderie helped them continue their personal fight against prejudice during and after the war. Although they confronted prejudice, Jewish men and women in the American military nonetheless gained visibility as American Jews. The heroic behavior of Jewish women as pilots, mechanics, nurses, women accepted for voluntary military services, flying nurses who pioneered air evacuation medicine like Etta Moscovitz, also called Yetta, which you see on the slide, and members of the Army Corps also proved the exemplary value of their service as they risked their lives in dangerous assignments. They showed patriotism, determination, and excellence as they crossed gender and social boundaries. After the war, Jewish women pilots participated in the struggle for the recognition of pilots of the WWII as military personnel, and that was obtained only in 1977. Some 30 years later, the Jewish women pilots I mentioned learned actually only after the war that more WWII members were of Jewish descent. In recognition of their pioneering military service, surviving WWII members like Bernice Falk-Hedu were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for service in 2009. To actually close this presentation, I would say that young women and men in uniform fought both as proud Americans and as Jews. Their struggle for acceptance and yearning for honor challenged the commonly held notion that Jewish identity was but a burden. Obviously, I gave you only a few examples, but I will gladly answer your questions. But I will really close by saying that this notion of Jewish identity as a burden resonates today throughout a world contaminated by the ubiquitous virus of anti-Semitism, which actually threatens democracy, a value for which men and women in the military made sacrifices. Thank you all for your attention.